建物とかがすごいリアルですよね、これ。すごいですよね。街が全部見えるんですよ、これ。そうです。横にやるとどこでも見えるんですよ、これ。はい、飛んだ。どこ行こう。どこに行けばいい。どうやって行けばいいんだろう。ジャンプ。あった。飛んでって。オッケー、着いた。
And this is how I first learned about Gravity Rush back in 2014. Gravity Rush looked like such an interesting game when I saw it demonstrated. I had to wonder how having the ability to simply fly around in any direction and save yourself from falls would make for a challenging experience, or if it would at all. That kind of gameplay mechanic seemed like a push-button-to-win design to me, but it was this particular thought that piqued my curiosity in the game in a way that compelled me to want to learn more about it, or rather, experience it. Of course, I don't think I was even aware at the time that the PS Vita was even a thing, since the device looked a lot like a PSP to me, so I assumed that was what it was for. At the time, I couldn't imagine owning a PSP or brand new current generation handheld at all. I was just about to enter college and was about to enter my broke era. Alas, the best I could do during this time was a certified pre-owned Xbox 360 Slim from GameStop. But then I moved to Japan, got my own place, and now actually had something I only ever got a small taste of previously: freedom. And I guess you could say that the connective tissue of my freedom in life could be tied directly to the freedom of Gravity Rush. When I found out that not only did the first game get a remaster on PlayStation 4, but it even got a sequel, I decided that those were the exact reasons I needed to justify getting myself a nice pre-owned PlayStation 5. For many, The Last of Us, Horizon Forbidden West, Spider-Man, or God of War might have been their reasons for getting a PS5, but for me, it was Gravity Rush Remastered and Gravity Rush 2. And now, I want to talk about this fascinating duology, its gameplay and its evolution from a home console port of a handheld game to a full-on native home console game. This is my video about Gravity Rush. It's a little strange for me to refer to this game as Gravity Rush, simply because I made this video playing the Japanese version, which is called Gravity Days, as so many fans probably already know. So if I accidentally refer to it as Gravity Days in any part of this script, my apologies in advance. Speaking of localization, there is actually something interesting about the way this game was localized in English that I thought was actually quite clever. The main character in this game is referred to in the English language version of the game as Cat, but the Japanese original has her name as Kitten. I actually like what they did there with the localization of her name, since Kitten in English as a name for a female protagonist doesn't carry the same sentiment, since kitten in English tends to be used as a term of endearment. Cat, specifically with a K, is perfect because it keeps the cat with a C pun intact while also tying it back to a real English name as an abbreviated version of Katie or something. To be honest, she definitely looks like a Katie to me. Anyway, the pun is important to retain since her powers are derived from Dusty, the cat with a C, who follows her around. The game is structured like an episodic epic, taking place over a series of individual main story missions that act as their own episode in the story. The story's presentation itself is like that of a comic book, which complements the game's graphical presentation while also respecting the limitations of a handheld device. While dedicated console games from other franchises have attempted similar styles of cutscene presentation in the past, the way that it is stylized here helps to give the story presentation its own kind of kinetic energy, which matches the gameplay style. There isn't much voice acting, but the voice acting is actually spoken in a fictional language that vaguely resembles some mix of Japanese and a hodgepodge of various Romance languages. Given the game's character designs being derived from a Japanese anime style mixed with its European American environmental design, it ends up making a lot of sense and actually creates a believable and immersive world for these characters to exist in. One of the things I love about fiction authored by Japanese writers is the deeply embedded tradition of implementing what we now call in the modern literary world magical realism. Kat's powers aren't necessarily normal, since she is often ostracized by the common folk, but it's not marveled at, or the supernatural aspect of her powers isn't highlighted as some kind of extra fantastic thing by all. It's just accepted that she's another one of them. I like that about the way the logic of this world flows, and it gives the game a very Sino-Japanese flavor. Another aspect of Gravity Rush, which is seemingly indicative of the fact that it was developed by a Japanese development team, is the fact that its design philosophy is ultimately centered around one singular idea, and for Gravity Rush, it was the control of gravity for the facilitation of movement. Executing this in a 3D space has proven not to be an easy task. If you consult YouTube gaming creators over the last decade, even 2D games like Mega Man 5's Gravity Man stage has received complaints for its gravity-based action platforming challenges. That isn't to mention Sonic Adventure 2's gravity-based platforming, and even Super Mario Galaxy's gravity-based platforming hasn't been totally free from criticism. So what happens when not only you can take on gravity-based platforming challenges, but you can create them yourself by manipulating the direction of gravity's pull? How would this control in the first place? That's what I found myself asking when I first saw this game demonstrated. It turns out the controls are quite intuitive. Kat moves using the standard layout, that being controlling Kat's movement with the left analog stick and the camera with the right stick. Jumping is accomplished by pressing X, and Kat can execute a dodge by moving the left analog stick in the desired direction of the dodge and pulling the L2 trigger. But how do you manipulate gravity? Before I answer this question, it must be understood that Kat does not fly through the air. She's only ever falling. This is a fact to be mindful of, since understanding this fact really helps psychologically prepare the player that this isn't a Superman kind of traversal through the air. The gravity manipulation is activated by pressing R1. Doing this will suspend Kat just above the ground if she is already standing on something, or suspend her in position in the air if she was mid-fall. From here, her orientation can be changed using the left analog stick, and she can be pointed in any direction for 360 degrees in the entire 3D space. Once she is pointed in the direction you want her to travel in, she can change the pull of gravity so that it pulls her in that direction by either pressing the X button or by pressing R1 again. She can receive a boost by pressing and holding X, which increases her traversal speed. Pressing R3 will reorient the camera relative to the world's unaltered gravity, and the pull of the world's unaltered gravity can be indicated visually by Kat's hair and cape, which continually fall in that direction until she herself begins falling in the direction of gravity's pull. Pressing L1 will completely deactivate her gravity powers immediately, and wherever she is, Kat will fall back down to the pull of the world's real gravity. There is no fall damage in Gravity Rush, so if she falls from the height of a skyscraper and hits the ground, she'll just take a little longer to recover from the fall without any damage taken. Kat can also slide along the ground, and this is accomplished by moving her forward with the analog stick and pulling both L2 and R2 simultaneously. Doing this will cause Kat to slide across whatever surface she's on, almost like she's sliding across ice on a slope. Since Gravity Rush is a superhero game, there is also combat. Cat's main attacks involve kicking, but there are different kinds of kick attacks. Standing on the ground normally and pressing the square button will have her kick. Pressing square in rapid succession will prompt Cat to do a standard combo attack. If she uses the dodge and kicks by pushing the analog stick in any direction, then pulling R2, then pressing square once the dodge animation is about complete, it will activate a relatively strong counterattack kick. If she slides into an enemy, the collision will automatically trigger a sliding kick, which can be very strong against enemies. There is also a jump kick Cat can do when prompted to kick while in midair during a jump. Cat can also execute a gravity kick. This is accomplished by activating her gravity power, aiming her at an enemy's weak spot, and pressing square. Doing so will launch Cat at the enemy like a missile, dealing a strong attack. She can also dodge while in air by executing the exact same button combination to dodge while in the air. Cat can also throw objects at enemies. This is accomplished by pressing circle. This lifts a specific number of interactable objects in the environment, and once aimed at an enemy, pressing circle will launch one of the lifted objects at them, dealing damage. Cat can also execute any of 3 possible special attacks, each of which requires slightly different button combo inputs. These are pressing triangle to activate Spiraling Claw, up on the analog stick and triangle for the Gravity Typhoon, and down on the analog stick and triangle for the Micro Black Hole. I'll go deeper into what these attacks do later, but these are the controls for the game. I'm just realizing now that the controls in the international version of the game might be different from the Japanese version, which is the version I played for this video. If that's the case, I apologize for any confusion that I might have caused up to this point, since I have no experience with the Western version of the game whatsoever. I assumed that the controls between Japan and international versions were unified, but I'm sure they translate roughly similarly based on the mapping, right? One of the things that really made Gravity Rush stand out when it was first released was its utilization of motion controls. This might not have been an entirely standout feature back when it was first released on the PS Vita, since we were still in the thick of Xbox Kinect and Wii motion controls at the time of its release. And while some of the touchpad features of the original PS Vita game were changed when making the transition to PS4 for the remaster, what it retained was the use of the DualShock 4's gyro controls, which have since become standard in most controllers since 6-axis, as far as PlayStation controllers are concerned anyway, DualShock 3 notwithstanding. Some people don't like gyro aiming, and while I can respect it, I can't say I can match the sentiment. The fine-tuning aim adjustment the gyro controls offered in Breath of the Wild on the Wii U gamepad made me really appreciate just how much of a game changer this control option could potentially be when games were designed around the technology, and Gravity Rush is another key example of this. The primary way to aim Cat is by using the left analog stick, and while Cat does show some flexibility in adjusting for the relative inaccuracy of the analog input, gyro aiming is here to help fine-tune the aim in a seamless way that is unobtrusive and incredibly intuitive. Since the game was built around using the PS Vita's gyro controls as a handheld gaming device, you might often find yourself interacting with them and using them to your advantage in the game with the DualShock 4, or in my case, a DualSense, in a way that you didn't even notice. If ever there was a game that could serve as an argument in favor of the possibilities offered to the player in gameplay by motion controls, I think Gravity Rush deserves to be among the key examples to prove the argument. But how does all of this work? Gravity Rush is built around its central theme of free movement through shifting gravity in 3D space. This might sound simple to imagine, but executing the feel of the game can be quite challenging if the underlying systems aren't precisely nailed down. A big part of this in Gravity Rush is the functionality of the HUD. Once activating Cat's gravity shifting ability, there is a gauge in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Here shows a green gauge, a blue ring, and a circle in the center of the ring. These provide a lot of information vital to the game's main mechanics. The green gauge represents Cat's HP. The blue ring gauge represents the amount of energy left to sustain Cat's gravity manipulation powers, and the circle in the center turns red once Cat's special attack has become available. Because the game would be horribly unbalanced if Cat could just move freely as she wanted about the game's world without limitation, it was balanced with the gravity meter. Once her gravity powers are activated, the gauge slowly depletes. The longer she uses it without recharging it, the lower it will go once it becomes empty. Cat's power will wear off and she will instantly fall back in the direction of the world's default gravitational pull, wherever it is. The gauge can be refilled by either picking up one of the blue gems, which gives her gauge a full refill, or by deactivating her gravity power manually and giving it a couple of seconds to recharge, which it does instantly, not gradually. The gauge depletes at a fixed rate unless Cat is simply idling in midair, in which case it depletes significantly slower, obviously in the interest of not rushing the player to make a decision on where to move Cat. Furthermore, the gauge depletion is also a bit slower while Cat is sliding across the ground. Since this power isn't imaginably as demanding as the pure flying through the air power, this makes a lot of sense in a diegetic way. The red dot only begins to appear once Cat unlocks the Spiraling Claw. This circle is tied to the gate's special attack cooldown mechanic. Since the special attacks are pretty strong, a cooldown was necessary to implement in order to keep the combat balanced. When the red circle appears, the special attack is ready to use. Once used, the red circle will disappear and keep that area empty until the cooldown completes, which it will then regenerate. The regeneration of both the gravity gauge and the special attack are indicated by unique audio cues that play through the controller's built-in speaker, which can be especially helpful in busy scenes where glancing up at the gauge might not be entirely possible. HP can also be recovered by picking up green gems, which can regenerate Cat's HP significantly. Cat's movement through the air can be slightly modified mid-fall by using the right analog stick to help adjust her falling trajectory in the event of an inaccurate aim or if the targeted object or enemy has shifted position. Once Cat's powers are activated, a faint but still clearly visible blue target reticle appears. This is how Cat is aimed both in traversal and in combat. Anything inside the target reticle is what Cat will fall towards once she shoots in that direction. The same goes for what she throws at objects. The target must be inside the target reticle, after which case pressing the circle button to throw will land a direct hit. But this is a pretty strict system. While the game is forgiving for slight inaccuracies, especially during the gravity kick against a moving enemy, during which Cat will automatically move in order to stay locked onto the enemy or else lock onto the next enemy nearest to the target reticle's coordinates, it still requires you to do the work of aiming properly. That means just because an enemy might appear on screen doesn't mean that Cat will lock onto the enemy nearest to her without aiming. For some reason, during particularly intense action scenes, I made this mistake from time to time, kicking the wall or protruding objects other than the enemies. This is the game's way of making the combat more skill-based than it might otherwise have been. How the game's movement feels is a big part of its gameplay design. When Cat alters gravity, her entire physical orientation will also adjust relative to the change in gravity's pull. This means if gravity's pull is changed to orient with the side of a skyscraper, that particular side of the skyscraper will now be treated as the floor. If Cat targets the surface of a rock, which is upside down at a 45-degree angle, that is now the new downward pull. If she targets the bottom of a platform, now that is the floor and she will fall into the sky once she steps off of it. As the game progresses, these shifts in perspective relative to the pull of gravity become increasingly rapid, and for some players this might be a bit intense, especially if they are gunning for gold medals in the challenge stages, which often requires speedy movement and fluent execution of the game's movement mechanics. But if you ever forget what is where or where down is, you always have the option to recenter the camera by pressing R3, which will immediately snap the camera to a perspective behind Cat, which will give a clear picture of Cat's current positioning relative to the real world. Cat's movement through space carries a highly predictable inertia of motion, both while traveling through the air and in a jump, or while falling through the air with her powers. She doesn't lose all forward momentum immediately upon deactivating her powers while in motion, but she loses much of it since she can't control her fall in real-world gravity like she can when under her own gravity. But since that original movement is still there, she still does carry a residual movement as she falls back to the original source of gravity. Her attacks on land feature some forward momentum, which is simple to control. Sliding is interesting because not only does it have Cat slide across the surface of whatever she's on at a respectably high speed, but it also alters her gravity on the fly relative to the object's orientation. This means if a bridge moves in a spiral, Cat will slide along it, maintaining the perspective that it is always the floor. Sometimes she can get caught on objects or other rogue stage geography, but it is nonetheless controllable. The camera shifts its perspective one-to-one with Cat's, despite its distance from her, which might spark panic for the player at first. But Cat's inertia of motion here is so low that there is rarely risk of her falling off of something. If she stops completely while sliding, her gravity powers remain active. She will remain oriented with whatever surface she was on and treat it like it was the floor, though she won't be able to move too far ahead without sliding if the angle and orientation of the surface continues to change. It's something the feel of which you get to know as you play around with Cat's powers, and luckily the game facilitates that in a very diegetic way. Despite being a handheld game from 2012, Gravity Rush features an open world. But this is an open world that fits within certain realistic restrictions that are perfectly understandable within the confines of the game's story. Before anyone goes around categorizing Gravity Rush as more open world slop, I would argue, and I'm sure many already have, that Gravity Rush is an open world with a real gameplay purpose. There are actually a number of areas which become available as you progress through the story. In a way, it almost reminds me of the open zone design of Sonic Frontiers, but I'm getting ahead of myself. These are largely open yet confined areas of varying size, and they are designed to be most optimally traversed and explored using Cat's gravity manipulation powers. These areas are islands floating in the sky, and they are mostly vertical in their construction. While there are ways to and from critical areas using connecting stairs, it can take forever and isn't very exciting to look at. These open world areas instead incentivize the use of Cat's gravity powers to travel around them to different waypoints, or simply to collect precious gems. I would like to say with reasonable confidence that the point of these open world areas are the same in spirit as the initial area Mario spawns into outside of Peach's castle in Super Mario 64. Movement in Mario 64 is just as essential a game mechanic there as it is in Gravity Rush, and the best way to get a handle on all the different kinds of movement you can perform is through practicing it in a low-stakes environment with enough obstacles and discoverable incentives to make it worthwhile for control mastery. Straightforward tutorials, which have since become popular, are kept to a relative minimum here. You can look up the controls for certain attacks or types of movement at any time by pressing the options button on the DualSense controller and checking them that way, but getting used to the feel of the controls themselves requires practice, and since the story progresses only when the player decides they are ready by traveling to the story mission icon, the player can take as long as they like to get acclimated to the game's controls and feel. The mission structure in Gravity Rush exists in 3 different forms: the aforementioned story missions, challenge missions, and side missions. Story missions are missions that directly progress a game's story. This is how you move from episode to episode, fight bosses, and watch the plot unfold. Challenge missions serve as tests of your skills in controlling Cat and come in a variety of forms. There are freestyle races, which require Cat to use her full range of powers to race through a series of checkpoints to reach the finish line. Energy Get races, that's the Japanese version anyway, Energy Get races, are similar to freestyle races, except Cat starts with her gravity energy gauge completely depleted. She must race to pick up the blue gems to recharge some of that gauge and selectively use her powers in a way as efficiently as possible, since the gauge won't recharge automatically in these races like it does normally. She must keep collecting the blue gems in order to keep access to her powers. There are sliding races, where Cat is prohibited from using any of her other powers except the slide, again passing through a series of checkpoints before finally reaching the goal. There are also combat missions, which come in 2 varieties, one being a standard combat mission where Cat must defeat as many enemies as possible within a certain time frame, and another where Cat must do the same, except she must only use her throwing power. These combat missions actually loop in on themselves and repeat cyclically. Cat earns points with every enemy defeated, and the more laps she does, the tougher the enemies will be, and the more points she will get from defeating them. There is also a special challenge where Cat must clean up trash in the city by using her gravity lifting power to place them into a highlighted area. This is repurposed to also include the same for civilians in danger by Nevi, which spawn in around them, necessitating the prioritization of combat versus dodging and grabbing civilians, especially considering that once Cat is hit, she drops what she's carrying. There are also special Rift World challenge missions, which task Cat to execute certain actions within the Rift World. This is a freestyle race in Inferno and a style combat challenge in the Ruins, the latter of which grants Cat infinite immediate access to all her special attacks at will. Side missions are tied to the original game's DLC expansions, of which there are 3. These side missions also included the addition of extra challenge missions, but also included side stories which helped to add more character to the world. The side missions are relatively low-stakes sequences, which feature unique missions that act almost as tutorials for the challenge missions, though not always. There are 3 side missions: the Maid, Military, and Spy stories, each with their own corresponding costume that reflects the nature of that story. The missions vary widely, from a stealthy follow mission to a drag race to firefighting, etc. Each story, while short, does offer a unique narrative and a variety of missions which require the use of Cat's powers in different ways to accomplish the tasks she's assigned. Overall, the mission structure itself is very easy to follow. While traveling across the open world environments, you can check the map and set waypoints to the markers which clearly represent the different types of points of interest in the world, including manholes, challenge missions, side missions, and story missions. This is a structure very similar to that of the Xbox 360 game Crackdown. It's probably common knowledge by now, but Crackdown's mission structure layout was specifically mimicked by the development team for Gravity Rush, and having inadvertently played both these games in close proximity to each other, I can't help but to see the clear connection, although they do divert in some important ways, specifically as it pertains to scale and breadth of available content in the open world. Since Gravity Rush was developed for a handheld, the nature of the hardware requires the developers to exercise restraint when it comes to how interactive the environment and NPCs in it are. But since Japanese developers typically play things on the safe side in this regard, restricting total freedom for stable performance and focused storytelling, this divergence makes sense for Gravity Rush. The story in Gravity Rush details the origin story of Cat, who is essentially a superhero. A superhero origin story is the perfect background to build an RPG-style leveling system on top of, and that's what we get here. Cat has a surprisingly high number of various stats that can be upgraded, each involving different aspects of her gravity manipulation powers. These abilities include, but aren't limited to, her standard kick strength, her gravity kick strength, her sliding kick strength, her falling velocity, the number of objects she can lift using her gravity powers, and the potency of her special attacks. But these upgrades come at a price, and that price comes in the form of a currency in the game known as precious gems. Not to be confused with precious stones for any of those Sonic Shuffle veterans out there. That's another Sonic reference, heck yeah. These precious gems can be collected in a large variety of ways and come in 3 different forms. The first is a single crystal that is worth 1 precious gem. The next is a slightly bigger precious gem that is worth 10, and the biggest is a large crystal which is worth 20. These can be collected throughout the open world, and as well as in the Rift worlds, and can be won if you achieve the bronze, silver, or gold awards for the challenge missions. Ultimately, it is much more efficient to accomplish the latter for the fast track to leveling Cat's powers up to the max as quickly as possible. But the open world crystals incentivize exploration for those inclined to that sort of thing. If my commentary on Breath of the Wild's open world design is any indicator on where I exist on that spectrum, I fall strongly on the side of going where the gems are and exploring the world for the sake of it. Precious gems can also sometimes be collected as a prize for defeating enemies, but no matter how you might collect them, they are essential for building up Cat's strength. The leveling system isn't necessarily revolutionary if you've ever played an action game where you collect something which acts as a way to level up your character's stats. In Gravity Rush, it is straightforward. You spend precious gems to upgrade one of Cat's abilities. As you level up these abilities, the more precious gems it costs for the next upgrade. It might seem a bit grindy at first, but near the end of the game, you will encounter so many precious gems that if you've kept up reasonably well with Cat's stats, upgrading her abilities gradually as you move along, while also earning gold rankings in the challenge missions, you'll definitely come out of this section with a surplus of precious gems, even after upgrading Cat's abilities to their maximum strength. If you ever decide to go trophy hunting, and especially if you fight the rare Nevi in the Rift Plains, having Cat's powers upgraded is a must unless you want the added challenge of low starting HP and significantly weaker attacks. The Rift Plains are a bit of a pace changer in the Gravity Rush game design. They are mainly tied to the game's narrative, but can also be revisited at the end of the game in the interest of clearing the aforementioned rare Nevi trophies, or to unlock the trophies for speaking with the mysterious couple. At the beginning, these stages offer challenges that test the player's proficiency at the controls in ways that escalate in difficulty as the game progresses. One of the rift planes drastically reduces the ability for Cat to use her powers for an extended period of time, for example, which forces the player to route their traversal more carefully than they would have otherwise. Upon revisiting this particular plane, however, this aspect of the stage goes away, since with this handicap, accessing the rare Nevi and fighting it might be impossible. The only rift plane Cat can't return to is the one that serves more as a dreamlike sequence than an actual stage. Nonetheless, this is very interesting because it robs Cat of all of her abilities, completely forcing the player to interact with the 3D space and gravity switching vortexes carefully when finding their way to the end of each room. It isn't especially difficult, but it goes to illustrate just how much Dusty is essential for Cat in order for her to use her powers, because without Dusty, she is virtually powerless. Despite this, however, it does remind the player that Cat does have robust means of getting around stages by running and jumping. She can cross pretty wide gaps, and she can grab onto ledges of higher platforms and pull herself up like many other 3D platform games. Her animations, which are beautifully keyframed, communicate the quality and physics of her movement very clearly, even if you haven't really used her standard movement without her powers recently. I mentioned before that Gravity Rush being a game designed for a handheld device like the PlayStation Vita meant that its designers had to practice restraint in order to keep the game running smoothly, especially in terms of the game's scope and breadth. However, that doesn't mean the game can't be huge in its own way. While this is true regarding attention to granular detail, once you enter the Gravity Rush mid-game, you are introduced to a level of sheer size the world has to offer that you never considered existed despite the game's setting. Of course, now we live in an era with games like Tears of the Kingdom, where you have a world high in the sky, on the surface, and below the surface, with a scale that is unimaginable upon first seeing it on a handheld hybrid device. While Gravity Rush might now pale in comparison to that, the fact that this world stretches so far without seeing a loading screen, seamlessly transferring from the city above to the massive areas far below, was all designed for a handheld from 2012, remains impressive, at least to me, given the historical and technological context, unless I'm missing something. Gravity Rush might still be well within the constraints of a handheld form factor in its game design as far as the volume of content is concerned, which is something that becomes increasingly apparent if you play the remastered version for PS4, which doesn't add anything, but you have to respect just how much went into this game as far as its overall design and size of its world when keeping in mind the original platform's limitations and the fact that it had to be rushed out to meet the launch of the PS Vita. And that's really the big thing here. The fact that despite its graphical and performance enhancements as a remaster, including a higher rendering resolution, higher resolution assets, and a rock-solid 60 FPS, at least on PS5, it is still a handheld game, and that might owe in part to why the game might not have sold as well as it might have. Of course, we can speculate, and by no means do I personally claim to know, but having a dedicated full home console Gravity Rush with all the fixings and charm of the original, but with a beefier campaign and more side missions and challenge missions, we could have the complete package of the first game made more accessible to PlayStation owners who never owned a Vita, and a version of Gravity Rush the series deserves in terms of allowing the gameplay more breathing room. Luckily, we didn't have to wait long with the release of Gravity Rush 2. Gravity Rush 2 is a game that I have a hard time believing could exist in today's context. Not only evidenced by the closure of the studio that created it, but also Sony's chase for that one evergreen golden goose live service game at the expense of producing their signature single-player experiences. Indeed, Gravity Rush 2, a game in a series that had difficulty from the start and floundered in sales when remastered for PS4, it's kind of a miracle that this game was ever released at all. But I'm glad it was. Gravity Rush 2 aims to provide a proper, full home console experience of Gravity Rush gameplay while telling the unfettered remainder of the story that the first game attempted to in an unfortunately truncated way. Gravity Rush 2 contains a lot of similarities to its predecessor, but also approaches certain aspects of its gameplay design in different ways that helps to add to the game its own unique sense of structure and feel. One of the most immediately apparent changes from the original game are the graphics. Since this was built from the ground up to be a PlayStation 4 game with a PS4 Pro patch included on launch, it is no surprise that the game would be a vast improvement over the remastered version for the first game. The game uses 4K geometry and renders at an incredibly high internal resolution. It uses checkerboard rendering, which helps to maintain a crisp image without sacrificing performance. It returns to the cel-shaded style of the original game, but thanks to the pre-baked global illumination, the range of bright and shadowed areas see a much wider contrast than the first game. The game also utilizes a per-object motion blur, which is tastefully implemented to add a sense of intensity to motion, especially while throwing objects. The world itself is also much more expansive, providing 2 hub worlds that can be traveled between in real time and through the fast travel manhole portals. It should be noted that while the scale of the world is significantly larger than the first game, it isn't so massive that traversal is an especially laborious affair, and it maintains the tradition of travel between areas of the first game by including seamless travel. While the original PS4 and PS4 Pro targeted 30 FPS and were able to maintain them most of the time, playing the game on PS5 basically ensures that not only are you getting the full PS4 Pro experience, but you are getting an unwavering 30 FPS regardless of whatever is happening on screen. There is a trade-off to this, however, since because it is still effectively using PS4 Pro code, the PS5 hardware isn't being leveraged as much as it could be. Loading times are a bit slow for a game running on the PS5's famously fast SSD, and the locked 30 FPS is the best you can ever get, even though theoretically it should be possible for the PS5 to have the ability to target a locked 60 FPS, even at these graphics settings. But since there was never a PS5 enhanced patch released for this game, at least we can get the PS4 Pro version of the game. What Gravity Rush 2 also includes is a higher volume of physics-based objects. Battles in the large market in the early game can lead to an impressive level of physics-based objects flying about the scene, and with this increase in physics-based objects also means a greater number of objects Cat can use to grab and throw at enemies than was possible in the previous game. Probably the most PS4 part of this game is the LOD system. Because large areas of the map are traveled to and from in real time most of the time, the game uses a level of detail system that is very much of its time, exhibiting texture and geometry pop-in that can sometimes be a bit aggressive. But as a whole, Gravity Rush 2 is a beautiful game that expands on the art of the game by leveraging the higher rendering capabilities of home console hardware, while also retaining the heart of the original artwork, which were present in the previous game. Revisiting the old districts of Heckesville again in the game's second half goes to illustrate just how much the series benefits from the graphical facelift it received, creating more vibrant and detailed environments that were already impressive in the remaster. Gravity Rush 2 also preserves the comic book style of storytelling that the first game utilized for its dialogue-heavy scenes. While there does seem to be more voice acting in Gravity Rush 2, most of the dialogue is still mostly short phrases or single words in the game's fictional language. Probably the biggest difference in terms of narrative presentation is Gravity Rush 2's higher concentration of fully animated cinematic cutscenes. This is especially so in the last part of the game where the story reaches its climax. The presentation of these cutscenes is impressive. They are pre-rendered videos, but unlike in many cases where the discrepancy between in-engine assets and pre-rendered video can be painfully clear, it is very difficult to tell the difference, probably due in great part to the game's simple but high-quality art direction. The comic book sequences themselves are roughly identical in presentation to the first game, but it does not include French translations of the Japanese titles, instead opting for writing the fictional language's translation of the titles. The characters' speech boxes do center themselves on screen this time, instead of remaining in static positions like they did in the first game, but other than that, they're basically the same, especially in the way they each transition to and from the animated cutscenes. As a direct sequel to the first game, and released after the animated short, which tells the story of what happened between the events of the first and second game, Gravity Rush 2 basically functions narratively as a full-fledged, uncut sequel to conclude the first game's story. In essence, Gravity Rush was the made-for-TV movie, the animated short and OVA, and Gravity Rush 2 is the theatrical release feature. There is a great sense of environmental storytelling where the initial areas of the world are clearly separated by class, where the lower classes are below the layers of clouds, where it is seemingly always nighttime, to the lively city above, the huge, luxurious estates above the city, and the ships and bases of the military looking down above all. When Kat returns to Heckesville, the environmental storytelling doesn't stop. Heckesville's districts have all fallen under the all-seeing oppression of the surveillance state, and the heart of the place Kat used to know is greatly diminished. Even her own sewer pipe she called home is dilapidated, and the bed she was first so proud of is now infested with bugs. Probably most striking was the change to the industrial area, where before it was a busy machine churning out manufactured products that kept the heart running. Now, all of the towering structures that once belched smoke are mere shadows of their former selves. From afar, they still appear imposing, but closer inspection reveals abandonment, ruin, and industrial decay, the old smokestacks all filled to the top with concrete. Even the theme for this region has been rearranged from its original to reflect this. This especially stands out to me because I grew up with strong familial ties to Rochester, New York's third largest city by population, and home to the Kodak World Headquarters. I'm just old enough to have memories of what Kodak's industrial areas looked and smelled like when they were still operating, and also old enough to remember their deactivation and the subsequent demolition of vast swaths of the industrial parks. The company hired to demolish them, funnily enough, was the company owned by the family of one of my classmates, believe it or not. This kind of Rust Belt aesthetic is very relatable, and seeing it depicted in this way carries a lot of impact for me, since, at least to some degree, I lived it. As far as game design is concerned, a lot of aspects of the first game are carried over to the sequel. The open world design is marked with specific markers, which denote different kinds of interactable elements that either progress the story or help the player explore the stories of the NPCs through side missions or speech bubbles, as well as provide extra challenges for the player to expand Cat's skills, while testing their own in the game's various mechanics. You have the story missions, manholes, side missions, and challenge missions like before, but there are also new icons, one of which denotes recurring mining missions. These missions are actually introduced at the beginning of the game, where precious gems are mined. This is where you can grind out precious gems, but in some cases you will be met with gravity anomalies and you will have to fight off the invading Nevi. There is also another recurring mission option that involves a researcher who wants you to go down into the same area and take photos of fallen artifacts and where they are. Side missions and challenge missions both test the player's skills at the game's various mechanics, containing creative side story plots which find new contexts in which these skills Cat possesses are utilized. Stealth missions are fleshed out, time attack style missions are expanded on. There are missions which require Cat to assume the role of a battle nurse, where she must avoid using any of her powers and perform platforming and combat tasks using only her stock abilities. These missions in particular are basically mid-late game tutorials that teach you how to help save Cat from a long fall so that she doesn't smash into the ground when falling from a high height. I mean, doing so still doesn't result in fall damage, but her recovery time is drastically reduced. Challenge missions come in the same number of flavors as they did in the previous game, although there are some minor differences. One type of mission that comes to mind is the delivery style of mission. These involve Cat delivering a certain number of something before the timer runs out. These can be newspaper deliveries, delivering flyers, or delivering customers to a restaurant. Other times, some challenge missions are tied directly to side missions like the aforementioned flyer and customer delivery missions, as well as one where Cat must dress up as a popular idol and run through a gauntlet of totally randomized crowds through the busy streets, avoiding being noticed and stopped by those crowds. Of course, you also see the return of the standard slide and freestyle races, as well as time limit combat missions. There are also new missions which require Cat to use her new Luna and Jupiter Tune abilities, which I'll get into later. Basically, the sheer volume of side content in Gravity Rush 2 has been expanded significantly from the first game, rendering achieving platinum status for the game a lot more strenuous than the first game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if your biggest worry about the original game was that there wasn't enough content and content variation. Gravity Rush 2 effectively solves that issue. As far as the game's structure is concerned, it is interesting, and follows in the same tradition as the first game, where diegetic storytelling is concerned and how it incorporates gameplay. Specifically, this is in relation to the way the game tutorializes its various mechanics. The beginning of the game sees Kat totally without her powers, and it teaches the player about mining for precious gems. Later, when a gravitational abnormality and resulting Nevi invasion attack the mining party, Kat must use her regular platforming abilities to navigate increasingly hazardous platforming obstacles before finally being reunited with the source of her powers, Dusty. The ensuing combat sequence then teaches the player how to conduct movement and combat using Kat's gravity manipulation powers in the context that she is reacclimating to these powers she had been living without for a while. Afterward, Kat is invited to join a mining expedition again, which teaches the player more about this style of mission. Basically, the way the game tutorializes its various gameplay mechanics is done in a way that doesn't break the pace or tone of the storytelling. While it isn't a necessary thing for all games, it is respectable when a developer decides to go to this kind of length to integrate teaching the gameplay to potential new players as well as acclimate veteran players to the various tweaks made to the game's feel and controls. The changes to the game's feel comes down to the new physics engine being employed here. Probably thanks to the more robust processing power the PS4 CPU has over the mobile CPU in the PS Vita, this means that adding physics to more objects is possible, and that also means that the physics of Kat's movement through the air, especially when using her gravity powers, can also be tweaked. While not drastic, the physics of Kat's movement through the air is changed just enough to have an effect on how Kat maneuvers through the air. For example, when she does a gravity kick against an enemy, she bounces off of it, and every subsequent kick has her bouncing further away from it as she strikes a further distance. This is in contrast to the first game, where she mostly bounces off of enemies roughly the same distance every time. When deactivating her gravity power while in mid-fall, she will travel a bit more distance than in the previous game, depending on her velocity when the cancellation takes place. These physics changes are subtle, but just different enough to prompt some level of adjustment to Kat's controls overall. But the change to the feel of the game doesn't end there. One thing that I noticed when playing this game is that Kat seems to have a more dynamic gravity shifting ability when moving along objects when her gravity powers are activated than in the prior game. For instance, if she is running along an object that to the real world gravity is upside down and it curves, Kat's gravity power will shift dynamically with that curve as she runs, as opposed to the original game where this only ever happened if she was sliding. This makes the game's flow feel a lot smoother than it was in the original if your goal was to simply platform your way across an obstacle rather than slide, especially in the open world. The open world segments of the game follow along very similar design philosophies as the original, thanks a lot to the fact that the entire open world of the original game is present in its full unaltered form here. The new addition to the open world, however, is extremely interesting in that its design isn't as much like the first game, where it provides an open playground for experimentation with the game's movement mechanics, but instead is filled with hidden nooks and crannies, secret areas that you didn't even consider would exist, where they did. It goes beyond the comparatively simple lower areas of the original world maps, but instead has some real hidden areas that, when found, are a real treat to discover. The sense of discovery by using Kat's powers to explore the open world environments is where I think their design truly shines. They are also very interactive. Even Hecusville has more interactive elements thanks to the improved technology of the PlayStation 4. When it comes to controls, they are effectively the same, but with a couple of changes that might mess with the muscle memory of some veteran players. Running, jumping, activating, and deactivating the gravity powers, gyro aiming, dodging, combat, it's all identical to the original game. The biggest difference here is when activating the coup de grace at the end of a boss encounter, instead of pressing triangle, you press the touchpad on the controller. In fact, Gravity Rush 2 is the first PlayStation game I've played that actually utilizes the controller touchpad at all. Aside from the aforementioned coup de grace, the touchpad is also used to toggle between Cat's lunar, Jupiter, and regular tunes at will. This is accomplished by swiping up on the touchpad for lunar tune, swiping down for Jupiter tune, and tapping it to return Cat to her regular form. And now I guess is as good as time as ever to discuss what is probably the biggest differentiator between Gravity Rush and Gravity Rush 2. Lunar and Jupiter tunes are introduced and subsequently tutorialized in areas of the main story which function similarly to the Rift worlds of the previous game and in certain select challenge missions. The general effect these new powers have on Cat is that it alters the strength of the pull of gravity on her. The first one unlocked is the Lunar Tune. Lunar Tune significantly reduces the strength of gravity on Cat, meaning she can tread across the ground in long, slow strides, can jump very high by charging a jump for about 2 seconds, launch herself across chasms, and fall through the air like a feather. Her gravity kick turns into a teleport kick, where she will teleport to the targeted enemy and have the opportunity to deal several kicks to them before they go away. A bit like Shadow from Sonic 06 in how his homing attack functions. Thrown objects can also deal multiple hits against enemies once they make contact. This stun locks them while also dealing continuous damage. The only trade-off here is predictably that these attacks deal less damage than Cat's standard attacks of the same style. Her special attack is basically the Gravity Typhoon from the previous game and can be really helpful at crowd control and dealing damage to late game bosses. Because of the lower gravity, it means that Cat's regular traversal via falling through the air and her slide are slower thanks to her lower weight. Jupiter Tune significantly increases the strength of gravity on Cat. This means Cat can't jump very high and falls a lot faster. Her attacks are slower, but a lot stronger than her stock attacks. Her gravity kick can be charged to do massive area of effect damage to all enemies within the damage radius, and her ability to throw objects with the Jupiter Tune grants her the ability to combine all the objects she can lift into one giant projectile that, when fired, deals massive damage to the targeted enemy and deals area of effect damage to any surrounding enemies. Because Cat's weight is greatly increased by the Jupiter Tune, this means that she can fall through the air much faster than normally, and she can also have a significantly increased sliding speed as well. Her regular attack is a slow punch that can deal significant damage too, although it is noticeably shorter ranged and has a longer wind-up and recovery time. She also can't dodge if on the ground, but instead blocks. The cool thing about these new abilities is that, as mentioned before, these can be switched between at will. That means that you can find ways to actually combine the abilities of all these forms to enhance traversal and combat, especially combat. I'm still learning to get good at it, but the feeling of being able to get some kind of synergized combo going with these different forms during a particularly tough boss encounter is so rewarding. using the lunar tune to get Sirius altitude, switching to Jupiter tune and suspending Cat in the air at the jump's apex, charging the Jupiter tune gravity kick and blasting an enemy that way is one of my favorite things to do with this. There is so much you can do with these different forms because of the ways they expand Cat's powers, and it just goes to show that sometimes simple concepts introduced as expansions to existing means of movement in a game of this kind can open a wildly high number of different possible kinds of movement, limited only by one's own imagination. Similar to the first game, there are also a series of chapters dedicated to stages that can be easily compared to the Rift Plains from the first game. These task the player with performing certain actions with specific mechanics in order to satisfy the conditions to be allowed to progress further. These stages are far more specific in which mechanics they are teaching and have significantly stricter conditions they demand be met. Some of these tasks are on a timer, and some test the way in which you observe and interact with your surroundings. While far from difficult in any way, minus the final series of challenges, which really do test your proficiency at the movement and controls by actively restricting your ability to activate some of Cat's other abilities, which could be used to cheese the challenge, these do feel something akin to greater trials for Cat as she realizes her powers and becomes the master of them. I think about something like the Jedi Trials, for instance, in order to become a Jedi Master, although these are obviously very different types of trials. As a superhero origin story, however, this kind of training makes total sense, as, once again, a form of diegetic gameplay design. It really helps to sell the story's narrative while also encouraging and, in many cases, forcing the player to interact with some of the more advanced movement mechanics in Cat's arsenal of abilities. And indeed, some functional level of proficiency at Cat's enhanced movement and combat capabilities can make life a lot easier in the final episodes of the game, since exclusive reliance on her core abilities, while totally feasible, isn't always the most optimal way to navigate those late game challenges. Gravity Rush 2 reintroduces a revamped version of the leveling system introduced in the first game. This reworking of the leveling system still relies on the collected currency in the form of precious gems to pay to strengthen Cat's movement and abilities. There are some differences in how this is applied, however. While it serves the exact same function as it did in the first game, obviously, Gravity Rush 2 simplifies the original system by combining multiple skills within larger umbrellas that can be upgraded collectively when selecting the single umbrella or class of skills, rather than leveling them up individually like in the first game. Of course, this streamlining of the leveling system, both in menu navigation and in application of the skill points in general, is balanced by much higher thresholds per level reached. Previously, simply playing through the game and its extra content would usually be enough to almost guarantee that Cat will be at peak strength by, if not before, the end of the game. Here, if you want Cat to reach her maximum strength by the time the end game hits, you must interact with more than simply playing through the game and completing the gold medal in the challenge missions. While they can absolutely help, since the precious gem values per medal stack on each other, these are only good for a first-time run. Successive runs yield no further rewards, so can't be grinded. The best way to ensure Cat reaches maximum strength is also by going to the precious gem mining missions. These are basically playgrounds of extra content where Cat can fight Nevi and mine precious gems, which she can redeem to enhance her movement and combat abilities. As mentioned before, these do have a progression system within themselves, and although entirely optional, are probably essential for unlocking Cat's full strength in a timely manner. What's interesting is that the way these stat upgrades are structured, it almost gives the impression that you could theoretically partially level up certain stats, basically dumping precious gems into a stat and letting them accumulate little by little until finally reaching the level up threshold. Whether this is actually possible in practice or not, I actually don't know since I never tried it, but it is interesting how the way the percentage number climbs as you level up a skill seems to suggest that you can. Either way, leveling up exists along 6 different parameters, those being the kick, gravity, kick, slide, special attack HP, and fall speed. Related skills, sometimes 1, sometimes 3, are bundled together and upgraded uniformly depending on which general parameter you choose. It's simple and easy to navigate. Maybe a little more of a grind than in the first game, but at least proportional to the sheer volume of content on offer here. I don't want to spoil anything, but I just want to talk about Gravity Rush and Gravity Rush 2's endings. Gravity Rush's ending feels definitely like the end of a matinee shonen anime. The stakes are reasonably high. Heckersville is under attack by the military's fake Nevi-powered death sphere after it predictably goes rogue. It is up to Cat, her equal opposite in gravity superpowers, Raven, and her rival in the military, who uses technology to augment her abilities to match or surpass Cat's, Liza, team up to take out this foe. This is immediately preceded by the decision by Cat and Raven that they aren't enemies and a combat encounter with a Nevi invasion and between Cat and Liza. In this sense, it really does feel like a strong matinee shonen style ending, since through the power of teamwork, all 3 are able to finally destroy the Death Sphere. Gravity Rush 2, however, takes the shonen anime style ending of the first game, looks at it dead in the eye and says, "Hold my beer." Gravity Rush 2 introduces a number of new characters, including 2 angels, the 2 Special Forces-esque military fighters, one of whom is Liza, who returns in a combat outfit similar to the one from the previous game except much more advanced, Cat, Raven, a mysterious shining figure, and a prince. All of these characters, minus Carly, who is one of the angels who serves as the game's fake-out boss before the game's final sequence, converge into one ultimate battle that consists of non-stop combat from transformations, untold levels of powered-up characters who use their strengths to stop something, all under a real apocalyptic event that carries serious consequences if Cat fails, all taking place in the ruined center of the capital city of Heckersville, where the previous game also ended. This also is the only time in the base game where you are able to play as Raven, although she does have an entire DLC expansion dedicated to her own story, which converges with Cat's, although Cat plays a minor role in that. Probably the most striking part of this ending sequence that stuck out to me was the fact that the true final boss was actually designed to be one of those cinematic boss fights you are not actually allowed to win. This is not new in gaming, but the way it is implemented in Gravity Rush 2 is so immersive it actually had me believing that the game was cheating. Cat doesn't really have that much of a hard time dealing damage to the enemy, but just as soon as the boss gets down to low HP, he either summons a black hole or blows her away with his wings, making it impossible to deal the last couple of hits to defeat him. The black hole is especially frustrating because not only does it heal the boss to maximum health, and you essentially have to start over, but Cat's own powers, her HP and her leveled up stats, are taken away in increments. At first I thought it was a skill issue and I was doing something wrong, but it turned out this was all part of the plan. It triggers a cutscene where Cat is totally powerless, and the city's people sing her song, which then revives her powers to their maximum levels, where then she is able to deliver the final coup de grace. This whole sequence, from when Cat is in limbo as she attempts to return to her world and Raven is fighting the Shining Girl in the meantime, to this final boss battle and epilogue with Raven, is pure shonen kino, and I have no other word to describe it. It manages to be both gameplay and narrative heavy without any sacrifice to either aspect of the game. In this sense, it is very much akin to something like Shadow of the Colossus, and how these elements are combined in such a seamless way. It really does give the feeling that you are playing through an interactive anime, and it is one of the most stylish climax presentations in a game I've seen, at least, from this generation of consoles, that being the 8th generation. Victory is still earned, and it tests everything you learned about Cat's movement and combat abilities, but the story is told through the gameplay, and while the ultimate victory is largely scripted, on a first playthrough at least, you'd be hard-pressed to realize that fact quickly. If it's anything that can be said about the Gravity Rush series as a whole, it's that the emphasis on diegetic design in its most crucial elements make Gravity Rush and Gravity Rush 2 some of the most immersive narrative-driven experiences ever produced as PlayStation exclusive games. I almost forgot to talk about the HUD, so before I end the video, let's talk about the HUD. Gravity Rush's HUD consists of only the HP gauge and the red circle icon in the center of the blue ring. This element of the HUD is omnipresent, so it is always on the screen. The target reticle also exists as a blue ring of a moderate thickness. I've already mentioned this before, but I restate it just to emphasize the change in HUD design when going into the second game. Gravity Rush 2's HUD has a much slicker presentation. It also isn't omnipresent. The gauges and ring only appear whenever Cat's gravity powers are activated, and once activated, go away after some amount of time goes by without any further activation of those powers. While this element of the HUD is largely the same as the first aside from these two elements, it also contains a second gauge below the HP gauge. This actually fixes a problem I had with the first game, where it was difficult to judge how much it took to recharge the special attack indicator that appeared as the red circle in the blue ring. This new gauge is that fix, and it actually adds further depth to the game's combat mechanics. The red gauge fills as Cat uses her standard abilities to fight enemies. This means using her regular melee attacks, combo attacks, and her gravity kicks. This bar fills with every hit she manages to land. Once it reaches a certain quantity filled, the player has two options. The bar is tied to expanding Cat's abilities with throwing objects with her gravity powers in all her forms. The higher the bar is charged, the more potent her throws become. In her standard form, this means that one object will hit multiple targets and eliminate several enemies in one throw before wearing out. In Lunar Tune, it means that a thrown object will deal more continuous damage for longer when it comes into contact with an enemy. And in the Jupiter Tune, it means Cat can combine more environmental objects for a larger thrown object that deals more damage on impact and has a higher area of effect damage radius. This is a risk versus reward system, however, since if you choose to use it to power up Cat's throws, it will drain the gauge in increments relative to how much you charged the throw. If the gauge is fully charged, however, Cat can unleash her special attack, like her spiraling kick, gravity typhoon, or micro black hole, which themselves can also be incredibly powerful weapons in Cat's arsenal. Again, the simple addition of this single gauge adds so many additional layers to Cat's abilities that it goes to show that small changes can create substantially different experiences in game design. The only issue I really have with Gravity Rush 2 is the design of the target reticle. While much sleeker and higher resolution than its predecessor, I found that it was difficult to find on the screen during particularly intense scenes. And since Cat moves strictly in the direction of the target reticle, it can be a little disorienting, at least to me, since I can see the enemy, but when I think I have Cat aimed at the enemy and have her charge at them, she flies into a completely different direction. Maybe this is just a skill issue, but I could never fully adjust to it for some reason. Its appearance on screen just seems a bit too subtle for me, I suppose. But don't let what I have to say about this minor aspect of the game's visual design put you off. I'm likely in the minority opinion in this. Gravity Rush is a series that clearly existed during a time when unique visions of single-player focused games like this were allowed to exist, even in the face of their lackluster commercial success. It was a time where Sony, having learned the lessons from the mistakes made during the launch of the PlayStation 3, were bent on winning the goodwill of the gaming audience, and that's what they did with the PS4. Under today's conditions, there is no way a game like this would make it past the conceptual pitch stage, as evidenced by the fact that the studio responsible for creating Gravity Rush was shut down entirely. Gravity Rush had a chance thanks to a culture in the gaming industry that was willing to take chances on a unique concept that had the backing of a highly experienced and well-trusted director and a solid gameplay foundation. Even when it sold in mediocre numbers, it was allowed to be re-released on the PS4 and was even given the chance to conclude with a ground-up home console sequel. In recent times, it's clear we've lost that culture somewhere. Maybe Gravity Rush was never meant to be a blockbuster title. It fills a very narrow niche wherein the audience discovers it, rather than it discovers the audience. Word of mouth manages to propagate awareness, but it rarely escalates to the levels enjoyed by the likes of Elden Ring, for example. But that's okay. Cult classics have an appeal within their niche appeal. The fact that you can be one of the Gravity Rush enjoyers makes you part of a crowd who were able to see what the mainstream couldn't. While the days of this level of openness to experimentation and gameplay design in major games seems to be long behind us, we can rest assured that our physical discs hold the keys to the enjoyment of falling through space and enjoying unique game design at terminal velocity. Keep retromaxing.
L'aléa you pull le jour